Hello everybody, this is lesson 2 on King Lear, the King Lear monologue that begins blow winds and crack your cheeks. If you haven't already done the first lesson, you're watching the wrong video at the moment and you need to go back and do that first. If you have done that lesson, then you've read through the monologue that begins blow winds and crack your cheeks. You've understood the character of King Lear himself, you've understood the story and what's happening in the play at this point. You've also read through the monologue and added some of your own stage directions. So I'm wondering what sorts of things you've added to what he says, to his words. What does he say? What does he do to emphasize those words that he's saying? And it really helps here to have understood exactly why it is that King Lear is standing in the middle of an open field, dressed in rags, shaking his fists at the sky while rain pours down on him and soaks him and gets him absolutely drenched. And you'll remember it was because he starts the play as an extremely powerful, the most powerful man in the entire country, and he has his power taken away from him because he gets manipulated, he gets lied to, and as well as being a victim of other people around him who are taking advantage of him, he's also a victim, and he also suffers as a result of his own failings and his own sort of personal insecurities. You might be wondering why it is that Shakespeare chooses to write this character who has got all of these faults and got all of these flaws. I think this is absolutely deliberate by Shakespeare, and I think it's interesting if you think of older people that you know, and I certainly don't want anyone to be, pushing anyone to be thinking anything unpleasant about members of their family or whatever, but give it a bit of a try out, a thought experiment in your head. Do you know anyone who's sort of a bit on the older side, who's a little bit sort of belligerent and stuck in their ways and sort of sees their world in one particular way? Think as well, and I'm not going to push you too hard here, but about people who you might see on the global political stage, older men in particular, who are in positions of enormous power, and you think would therefore be behaving in a way which is responsible and wise and sort of, making the best decisions, extremely intelligent and sophisticated, but instead these powerful old guys are actually acting in a way which is petulant, childish, like a spoiled kid, right? That's the kind of image of King Lear that you want to have. A spoiled kid who is throwing his toys out of the pram, throwing a temper tantrum. If King Lear could have got onto Twitter to tweet about how unfair he thinks the world is being to him, you imagine that he probably would have done that. He'd probably be tweeting about how unfair everything is the whole time. But he can't do that because he's living in, medieval Britain. So what does he do instead? He goes out into a field, and you've said, I imagine that he's doing things like shaking his fists. Maybe he's kicking a rock or a bit of dirt. He's throwing his head back and he's delivering this speech right up into these tempestuous storm clouds which are soaking him in this torrential rain. That's the way that this needs to be performed. This is not a man standing in the middle of a stage, and performing, imagining he's in the middle of a field saying, blow winds and crack your cheeks. This monologue has to be delivered with the full force of a completely furious man shouting at the top of his lungs, waving his fists, and bringing all of the anger that he has inside him to bear on the sky and the weather at this moment as he stands in this storm. And why is he doing this? It's a little question I want you to think about just for a moment. Can you, and be honest, can you relate in any way at all to the idea of being very, very angry, very furious, thinking that something has been done to you that is fundamentally unfair? And you respond to this by behaving in a way which is sort of violent. Now, okay, Lear isn't kicking or hitting anybody else and no other human people, but his actions at this moment would be violent shouting and violent, fist shaking. I'm willing to bet that you can relate to this a little bit, even though you're not an old man and you're not a king and you haven't been, manipulated by your daughters into giving up your kingdom. You can't relate to their character, but you can relate to what he's doing. There is a word for this, and this word actually has been under a lot of scrutiny over the years, but we're going to use it in its most straightforward way today. This is a process called catharsis, sometimes called a cathartic action. And basically, if you've ever been really, really cross and you've slammed a door or you've, kicked something and for a split second, it's kind of made you feel a little bit better, be honest, it's been a little bit better sort of throw something or slam something. By getting out that kind of rage, that's what catharsis is. It's the feeling of venting your strong negative emotions by allowing yourself to sort of explode in a particular way, slamming the door, throwing something across the room, okay? I know this, I'm not condoning this behavior. We know this behavior is not a sophisticated and mature and grown up way for us to act, but I am saying that we can all kind of recognise what's going on here, because Shakespeare wasn't always telling us how to behave, but Shakespeare had a very good understanding of actually, you know, this is what people are like, okay, even if they're people who are in a different kind of sort of context of life, okay? So so that's what's going on here. As long as you've got your head around that, that's absolutely great. I want you to have a read through the speech again by accessing that link, remembering that you can read on one side of the screen a sort of modern verse translation to understand parts of it if it's not clear from the original language, but get your heads around the original language as well. For today and for this, it's not going to matter if you don't grasp every single word and every single line of what's being said. Instead, I just want you to get the general gist of those emotions that he is expressing here. So you've added your stage directions, you've had to think about that, and you'll see that the objective and the ideas that we've got to be looking at today, they start on slide 3 of your PowerPoint. That's lesson 2 PowerPoint, and we're following on from here, and it says analysing language. So you've done lots of this before, you know how to analyse language. We're going to have a little bit of a look at the language from the King Lear speech today. And I've just picked out for you today 3 moments from the speech for you to be thinking about. So there's a pause point coming up in a moment where I'd like you to stop this video, look at these 3 lines of dialogue written by Shakespeare, spoken by the character King Lear. And in your exercise books, which you've got in front of you, you can quickly write out those 3 lines of dialogue, and you can then extend those just by jotting down now some notes about what you think is interesting about the specific choices of language that the writer has chosen in this instant to get these ideas across, okay? If you know the terms and the names of any of the devices, the techniques which are being used, that's really excellent. Start here. We're going to move on in a moment, and I'm going to reveal some of the things that are going on here, but I want you to have a go at this yourself first, and this only needs to be a couple of minutes, so no longer than 3 minutes spent looking at these 3 lines here, because there's a few other bits to get to. So the pause point is coming up now, so I want you to stop this video now, and now we're back, and hopefully you've got on board with that, you've stopped that, and you've had a little bit of a think about those 3 lines of dialogue here. So let's go through them one at a time. You can actually move forward now onto the next slide, which is slide 4, and it will tell you a couple of things will come up with what we've got here. So first of all, line number 1, here I stand, your slave. Here I stand, your slave. Now, what I notice about this language is that it's very sort of grand language. Even though he's in this position where he feels robbed of all of his power and all of his confidence, he's still got this dynamic sort of, you know, air of speaking like he's a king. Here I stand, right? You can't help but deliver that line in a way which is really sort of pompous and grand, okay? But more interesting is he says, your slave. Here I stand, your slave. Don't forget, he's talking directly to the storm clouds. So if you said, or you spotted that this technique is a metaphor, you're absolutely right, because the reason is, you know, he is not a slave, and he is not the slave of the weather. That's not literally true. So in this case, it's a metaphor. But really, why is this interesting? Have a think about this for a moment. Why is it interesting that he chooses those words? And I hope that you might think and you might notice that it's interesting because to choose that particular word, to talk about being a slave, is the absolute bottom rung of the kind of social ladder that he could possibly choose. And he started at the very, very top of that ladder. You couldn't get any higher on that ladder than he was. The King of Britain. That's it. There's no one above him. And now he is, in terms of a metaphor, calling himself a slave, and a slave is somebody who is so low down at the bottom of the pile that they don't have any rights, they don't have any control or any identity of their own, okay? So he's sort of saying this in a grand way, but he is recognizing, isn't he, how much of his power he has lost through the clever use of that particular choice of word saying that he's a slave. He's also pointing out the fact that he has no control and no power in the situation, which is the rain is falling on him, okay? And that's true for all of us. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a prince or a queen or a prince. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter how much money you've got, how much land you own, how many castles, how many guards you've got. You can't boss the weather about and tell it, you know, whether it's going to rain or whether it's going to be sunny or whatever. That's just clear. So there is actually something quite true although it seems contradictory, there's something quite true as well. The fact that he is not in control of the weather, that's just a basic fact. Okay, I'm going to pause this video now. I'm going to move on to video 2, which will be the next part of this.